The Industrial and Gilded Ages, Section 5 with Ms. Lashy. Labor unions. Labor unions formed as a result of low wages and dangerous working conditions. Big business was taking advantage of immigrants. They worked for higher wages, shorter working hours, and safer working conditions. So with a labor union, you would get a lot of people together to join together, and they would collectively bargain for higher wages or shorter work hours, better working conditions. These are things that they needed to improve their lives, both financially and health-wise, because so many people were being injured on the job because the factory workers just weren't caring about the little people. Labor union tactics. Labor unions provided a collective voice through collective bargaining. They also used strikes, or refusing to work until their demands were met. Sometimes boycotts would also be used. So collective bargaining is when you get a lot of people together and you have a larger voice because you have so many people asking for the same thing. You have a better chance of having your demands met. Strikes are essentially when you just stop working. You refuse to work until your demands are met. Boycotts are when you refuse to buy or purchase an item or use a service. So that puts an economic pressure on a company to possibly meet the demands of the workers. The Great Strike of 1877. Railroad workers' wages were cut 3 times. They blocked the trains until their last wage cut was reversed. So essentially, these workers were upset that they had their wages cut not once, not twice, but 3 times. And so when the third time happened, they demanded that their wage cuts be reversed back to the second wage cut, and they just wanted to not suffer as much. So they were okay with a couple wage cuts. They understood that the company might have been having some issues, but they were saying, hey, we can't work past this wage. You can't do this. And if you're not going to reverse this third wage cut, then we're going to hightail it out of here. We're not going to work for you. The Homestead Strike of 1892. Andrew Carnegie's steel company needed more workers to produce steel. He hired more unskilled workers to keep up with the demand. Skilled workers who were already working for him went on strike. The skilled workers clashed with the security force and several people were killed. So what happened with this was previously only skilled workers were working for Andrew Carnegie producing steel. So he could keep up with the demand because a lot of people wanted to purchase the steel, he had to hire unskilled workers. And the skilled workers were concerned because they were being paid a higher wage because they are skilled workers. They have a skill. So it's like having some kind of certification that you get paid more because of it. And so when these unskilled workers were hired to do the same job, the unskilled workers were concerned about their job security and their wages. They didn't want to see their wages cut because these unskilled workers were working for a lower wage. So that's what caused the Homestead Strike of 1892. The Pullman Strike of 1894. The Pullman Company cut wages for their railroad workers. These workers lived in company-owned homes but refused to lower the rent. They went on strike but were not successful. So with this one, what happened was you had a lot of, let's say, company towns where you worked for the company and you lived in the town that was run by the company. The company owned the homes, they owned the local stores and businesses. So you were essentially taking the wages you were making from the company and turning around and paying the company back to live. So when the Pullman Company cut their wages, their workers were still living in the company-owned homes, but they didn't lower the rent. And so they're making less, but still having to pay higher rents, and the company wasn't even trying to meet the workers halfway, and so they went on strike, but they were not successful with it. If you look at this political cartoon here on the right, we have Mr. Pullman. He's the one standing with the top hat. If you look at the scarf, you can see where it says Pullman on it. And he has this press. And on the press, it says low wages on the top and high rent on the bottom. And then in the middle, there's a worker, and it looks like it says labor or something like that, and you see money falling out of him. So that's symbolizing that the Pullman Company is pinching or squeezing the worker between low wages and high rent and just trying to get whatever money they can out of them. The Haymarket Riot of 1886. The most famous of industrial strikes, also called the Haymarket Affair. Strikers wanted an 8-hour workday. Police had killed some strikers the previous day. The strike turned into a riot after someone threw a dynamite stick into the crowd. 8 anarchists were convicted for the crime and 4 were executed. So basically, with the tensions from the previous day, it kind of escalated to the next day, in which basically made it turn into this big ordeal. The strikers were demanding 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will. If you see that diagram on the right, it shows it. If you add 8 plus 8 plus 8, that equals 24. So basically they're saying we want to work 8 hours, we want to sleep 8 hours, and then we want to have 8 hours to do what we want. So to have basically like a work-life balance. Factories. Most factories employed immigrants for low wages, working long hours in dangerous conditions. Women and children made up the majority of workers in textile factories. Women and children were paid less than men. Children were often given the most dangerous jobs. So a textile factory, it's just a factory that makes fabrics or clothing, like not necessarily clothing, but cloth that you would use to make clothing or bedding. So it's fabrics. That's what textile is. And quite often they would employ women and children because they could pay them less than men. And the children were given the most dangerous jobs because they were small and they could stand on the machines, as you can see on this picture here on the right, that we have 2 children standing on the machines barefoot. One of them is barefoot at least. Very, very dangerous. They could also climb into the machines, under the machines, and quite often children would lose fingers or toes or hands or limbs or even die. And there wasn't any law to protect them. There weren't any laws to protect the men or women who were also working, the older ones. So it was a really not a good situation for workers or factory workers in the late 1800s during the industrial and Gilded Ages. They didn't have anybody looking out for them. Mines. Factories were bad, but mines were even more dangerous. Mines hired children to mine coal and other minerals. They often worked with open flames around flammable materials. So if you look at this picture at the top, we see 2 children in a cart. One child is pulling the cart, the other one's pushing the cart. And what we can assume is in the cart is most likely coal. That was a very, very big thing that they would have people mine, especially children. In the late 1800s, they used it as a fuel source, a way to cook food, and a way to heat and light their homes. And if you notice on the top of the cart, they have this little candlestick with an open flame. So you have this open flame next to this highly combustible or highly flammable material, and quite often it would catch fire, and it was a very hazardous working condition for whoever was in the mines.